I watched The Breakfast Club for the very first time last night, and I've wanted to see that movie for years. But everybody around me said, no, that movie's just okay, I don't really want to watch it. I feel like that's the kind of movie you should watch with other people. And interestingly enough, according to TV tropes, there are places on the internet where you absolutely cannot bash that movie without getting verbally attacked. So I did end up watching it by myself, but I got to think about it for the last day or so. And while I don't think it's... Well, I didn't get obsessed with it the way so many other people do. I don't think it's a bad movie. On the contrary, I think it's a great film. And I think there's parts of it that are clearly worth remembering. I see why it's become this pop culture phenomenon. But on the other hand, there are parts of it that have aged extremely poorly. The big thing that stands out is how Bender keeps harassing Claire and gets together with her. Fun fact, my last name is Bender as well. So when I introduce myself, this is always what I bring up. It's like, Bender, yeah, like Futurama or like The Breakfast Club. One of those two is my go-to. It's kind of funny how both famous pieces of media where the character's name is Bender, they happen to be criminals. I wonder what that's going to say about me. Probably nothing, they're just coincidences, but still. How dare you assume people named Bender are criminals, Hollywood. How dare you? Going back to the stuff that aged poorly, even though I'm not a marijuana smoker, I know that part is a little silly by today's standards. But the designated love interests, especially Bender and Claire, that relationship screams abusive. Especially because I do know that there are people out there who play hard to get. Nothing about her indicated she was. And namely, especially in the beginning, I definitely found him hard to take in the first third of the movie. But like the other characters, I did learn to bond with Bender. I did learn to bond with the other characters. I see it from a much more cynical lens than other people do. I don't see this happy-go-lucky movie. Apparently a lot of people don't either. And I see, but the parts that aged really well are the fact that people from different parts of society, whether they have social approval or money or not, they still have issues too. And popularity, fame, money, the love of other people does not protect you from having issues. It's very similar to a book called The Outsiders, which is about two groups fighting each other. One's the rich preppy kids and some poor greasers. And their rivalry that ultimately ends in a kid's death. Whereas one of the main characters, he falls in love with one of the rich girls from the other side of town, from the preppy gang. And she says, it's rough all over. If I could sum up this movie, The Breakfast Club, in a sentence, it would be that. It's rough all over. And you can argue who has it worse, but the truth is they all have it pretty bad. And anyone who looks well-adjusted on the surface is exactly that. They just look more well-adjusted on the surface. And namely Brian, this sweet nerdy kid whose parents are pushing him to always study and have the best grades. And Claire, who's the rich girl who's neglected by her abusive parents. I found, although reading into it a bit more, I did find it interesting because they all claim that they're school stereotypes, but they do a few new things with it. For example, this is one I read. I didn't think of this myself, but Andrew Clark, he's not a football player, he's a wrestler, which is cool to see because you see a lot of football players and you usually see jocks as jerks. adds to the message of the film. You still see a little bit of that. And then you see Bender the criminal, you see the sweet nerd, you see the artist, Allison. And you get a sense of each of their dysfunction. The thing about it is, it feels realistic. I think that's why I can't get super obsessed, because it feels too real to me at times. And especially seeing how this took place in the 80s, and I feel like it's more a reflection of that time period. Obviously, I have never lived through the 80s, never going to. But seeing enough 80s movies, it feels realistic and reflective of the cultural values of the time period. One thing that I know has changed is that people do tend to integrate with social groups a bit more. I did find that this movie was extremely honest. As Brian asks, "Oh, are we going to be friends by Monday?" And Claire says, "Likely not." And she's called vain and conceited for saying that, but she is right. She's got a point. I personally do agree with her. I see this movie from a cynical lens. I don't think they're going to be friends by Monday. I don't even think they're going to stay friends. Maybe they'll reconnect later at a high school reunion, but I don't think it's going to be a lasting bond. I see it as more, they all came out of this having learned something about a different kind of person. Some people say no one learned anything. I disagree with that too. I do think that they all came out of it having gained something. Having gained an insight into someone else who they think has no problems. Because it's very easy to look at a certain kind of person and think, okay, their life is easy, they got no problems. Oh, come on, people like you, you have friends. What problems could you possibly have? Could write essays on this. Apparently, I see on websites like SparkNotes called Schmoop, there is an analysis section for this movie. But I think you can see the influence on Community, that show. Which I love. I think what I get a little more into Community, because Community, in my experience, is one of the most realistic depictions of friendship I've ever seen. I don't have a lot of good experiences with friendships. But Community also had an element of the fantastical, so I could have some distance from it. The Breakfast Club got way too real, for me, at least. Doesn't make it a bad movie, and I probably will rewatch it. But there are parts that are very, very hard to take. Interestingly enough, another thing that gets criticized about this movie is Allison's makeover. Well, it wasn't needed. And a lot of people see that as taking away her individuality, which, yeah, kind of. I do think she looked better before. And she had this individual sense to her, but I read this analysis about it, that she was unhappy living on the outside of all the social cliques. She was not happy being isolated, wasn't happy with that individualism. So she was happy to finally be accepted. And there is so much room for these characters to grow and change as people. I mean, supposedly the brain doesn't stop developing until your early 20s. So it is fun to speculate where these characters will be. I do think there will be ongoing problems that they'll have, because mental health care at this time, from my understanding, was not that great. So I think all of them, who do I think is going to come out the most okay? I don't know, because I see it as they're all equal levels of... They have equal levels of issues. Well, depends on what you view, but they're clearly equally unhappy and coping with it in different ways. If anything... Who do I think is going to be the happiest? Definitely not Bender and Claire. That screams abuse. They're going to be fighting constantly. Allison's probably gonna have identity issues, so it's come down to either Brian or Andrew. One of those two. I think Brian or Andrew's probably gonna make it out the most okay. But they gotta get away from their families first. It's one of those movies that you can really see. I can see this lasting, and I can see as society changes and as culture changes, with this movie, whether it's positive or negative, there is a lot to unpack and there's a lot to talk about. I think that there are things about it that will always stay timeless, namely the idea of that it's rough all over and everyone has problems. People who seem like their life is perfect, it's not. That's a myth. But the way we view relationships, what's appropriate, whether or not these kids would have been expelled for what they did versus what would have gotten off much easier. For Claire, ditching school I don't think would have gotten that much punishment. Also, 8 hours on a Saturday, I don't think schools do that anymore, can they? I don't know. Mine certainly didn't. Detention was more of an after-school thing. That's only scratching the surface of The Breakfast Club, but it is a very good movie. And definitely worth talking about and remembering.